The disease has already claimed more victims than Legionnaire's disease and toxic shock syndrome combined.
This is the deadliest outbreak of Ebola on record.
There are a lot of experts around the world who do not yet know how contagious this is, how deadly this new virus is.
Here in the U.S., panic is increasing around the world about the pandemic.
And the disease spreads to North America. The consequences are multiplying.
The World Health Organization has declared a swine flu pandemic.
Is the world ready for the coronavirus?
Cholera, bubonic plague, smallpox, and influenza are some of the most deadly diseases in human history. And when they spread across regions of the world, an epidemic becomes a pandemic, and it can result in more deaths than wars and natural disasters.
A good example of that is the 1919 influenza pandemic, which took place just as the First World War was ending. Some historians believe that up to 100 million people died. In other words, many more people than died in the war itself.
And when a newly identified coronavirus emerged in China in late 2019, governments reacted like they had in the past, with quarantines and travel bans, while researchers raced to create a vaccine.
We tend to think about managing an epidemic episode like this in terms of the sort of public health or science, but in fact what I would argue is that the root of many of the issues here are sort of social, cultural and political issues, practices, how people live, working environments, how people travel, why they live in cities.
In 1980, some predicted that science would overcome epidemics. That was the year the World Health Organization declared one of the biggest killers in human history was eradicated: smallpox. In its 3,000-year existence, this one disease killed an estimated 300 million people worldwide. The global vaccination program had prevailed, and many virologists at the time were declaring an end to infectious diseases.
And that's a sort of shining example, right, of our great optimism that human societies could actually put an end to disease. At the time that smallpox was being eradicated was precisely the time that other emerging infectious diseases like Ebola were coming onto the scene.
Smallpox is still the only human disease to be eradicated, and more have been popping up, making the jump from animals to humans.
When people started to settle and cities developed about 10,000 years ago, our relationship with animals obviously changed, and spillovers took place, like smallpox, measles, tuberculosis, influenza, etc., originated in animal populations. And obviously that was a very big change from hunter-gatherers, where there wasn't the possibility of diseases to be sustained in large populations.
Diseases that are able to live between species like SARS make it nearly impossible to eradicate. And that's why the plague, which exists in rodents and killed between 75 to 200 million people in Eurasia, still exists to this day.
Ebola, MERS, SARS arise through very complicated interspecies relations, and they exist in reservoirs in the wild. Those diseases are very difficult for us to tackle.
Wild animals are just a small piece of the puzzle. The last century saw an industrialization of livestock, making a perfect intermediary for diseases. And in 2009, we saw the H1N1 influenza virus make the jump from pigs to people.
The world is now at the start of the 2009 influenza pandemic.
The US Centers for Disease Control and Prevention estimated that as many as 575,000 people died from H1N1 during the first year the virus circulated.
So when you mass produce animals and you have an outbreak, it's very easy for the disease to move very rapidly through the animal populations. And then linked to all of these is bigger environmental issues. Climate change means that diseases that could exist in some areas are moving into other areas. We're seeing mosquito-borne diseases move into areas where it wasn't posing a problem.
According to the WHO, a global temperature increase of 2 to 3 degrees Celsius would increase the number of people who are at risk of malaria by around 3 to 5%, or several hundred million. Malaria already killed 405,000 people in 2018. And linked to all of this is urbanization. Millions of people living side by side, allowing diseases to spread rapidly.
There are sort of environmental reasons why diseases happen in certain places, but I think that the fact that you've got mass cities, the fact you've got a lot of people moving, certainly helps in the spread of disease.
And that's why how governments respond is more crucial than ever. Critics of the coronavirus travel bans say it only exacerbates the outbreak. Shortages become more common. People suffering from non-coronavirus related illnesses have difficulty making it to hospital, and many flee before the measures are implemented. There isn't sufficient data that shows travel bans actually do anything to stop the spread.
It's interesting that as this coronavirus outbreak is happening, we've got an H5N1 outbreak in a poultry farm in China, we've got H1N1 in Taiwan. There are many other diseases around and they could pose problems. We've had the African swine fever decimating the pig population. 300 million pigs have died. So I think there's an issue about what diseases gets focused on, why it gets focused on, what the politics of that is.
What's clear is in order to tackle infectious diseases, a more integrated approach that considers all of the variables is needed.
Over the last 10-15 years, there's been a move towards One Health, which is an integrated health that essentially tries to put human health and animal health together, to say that actually we can't deal with human health unless we integrate and think about what's happening in animal populations. But I think we need to go further in a much more integrated approach that draws on insights about how human behavior determines disease dynamics. Unless we understand these cultural, social processes, I think we're not going to be in a very strong position in the future to tackle outbreaks.
Understanding that new outbreaks are a complex issue that depends on more than just vaccines and sanitation, that they're interwoven in the way we live and consume, is perhaps the first step in tackling pandemics.